this morning. I have a few housekeeping things to do before that, some of which I'm prepared to do, some of which I'm completely unprepared to do in this moment. So let me get organized here. So let's get going. Welcome, I'm Vicky Clark. I am the Policy Director for Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. I use she, her pronouns. And I want us to start today with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual, and those participating are joining us from many lands. Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes are two statewide organizations, and we acknowledge that the land our offices in the Puget Sound sit on today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose land you're on, look in the chat in a minute where you'll find a link to a map you can use to look up your place on the land. Without these communities, we would not have access to this environment, and we take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. I want to also note that we're recording this session along with the rest of the sessions for the summit, and they will also be available. They will all be available after the event. So this session is an awesome two-part session. So just to send you in the space here, we're opening with a welcome address with Secretary of Transportation from Washington State Department of Transportation, Roger Millar. I'm going to spend about 30 minutes with him, and then we're going to kick it over to several other folks at WashDOT for a conversation about show us the money, how to get it. We all need the money to build awesome new infrastructure. And so several folks whose names are all on the screen, and that is going to be a session immediately after this. So with that, you all know this by now, the Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington State, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. I want to take a moment to thank our awesome sponsors whose collective contributions have made this possible to bring together expert speakers, 14 panels, registration free for all attendees. So thank you to the Washington State Department of Transportation, Columbia Bank, and Darrow. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Bob Chamberlain, who is Active Transportation Division Director for WashDOT, who is going to introduce Roger, who you already see on the screen, and moderate this section. So with that, over to you, Bob. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. And it is genuinely an honor to get to introduce my boss's boss, Roger Millar, Secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation. Roger has a really long and illustrious career, and I could read you all of the things that he has done and the positions he's held. What I want to do is highlight a couple of things specifically. One is that he's been a leader in the Complete Streets movement from the beginning, and that really shows up today in our work at WashDOT. Another is that he has led our efforts as an agency, and then at the national level, a move to be explicitly anti-racist, to acknowledge the history that we have all inherited that we're living with, and to work on making things better for everybody who needs to use the transportation system. I don't want to spend time on this intro because I want you to get to hear his remarks and then get to our questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roger, and he's going to do a screen share, and I will go off camera for that.
Well, good morning, and I am doing a screen share, and I trust you can see a slide. Very good. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Greetings from Spokane. I wanted to spend some time today talking about a resilient transportation system for a rapidly changing world. A little bit about resilience, safety, the Move Ahead Washington Package, Complete Streets, and our active transportation plan. As soon as I get the There we go. So our strategic plan has three elements. We have a mission, we have vision, we have values, but we have these strategic plan elements. Developing our workforce, which is recruiting, training, retaining qualified people to do the work, because without people, it's not going to get done. Our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and our commitment to resilience, to a transportation system that is safe and sound and smart. And I could spend all morning talking about workforce and diversity, but what I want to talk about today is resilience. There we go. We have a basic need for a resilient transportation system. That's a system that is planned for and capable of bouncing back from whatever comes our way. I think the unofficial motto of WashDOT is you cannot make this stuff up in terms of some of the stuff that comes our way, but we need to be resilient in the face of climate change and all of the impacts of climate change. There are disasters we need to be ready for that are not climate change related. We have a subduction zone earthquake in our future. We have failures like the Skagit River Bridge and others, and increasingly cybersecurity is an issue for the transportation system. We need to be resilient in the face of our changing demographics. Our friends at the Disability Mobility Initiative have pointed out that 25% of Washingtonians don't drive. That's almost 2 million people. And as our population ages, and AARP estimates that the average male will outlive his ability to drive by about 7 years. Doesn't mean us guys won't be out there driving. We will just outlived our ability. The average woman by 11 years. How do you, particularly if you live in suburban or rural Washington, how do you maintain your quality of life and your independence and your dignity when you have to hang up the car keys for the last time? We need to be resilient in the face of that. And we need to have a transportation system that recognizes and responds to our changing economy. Why is this important? You know, we have a pretty robust budget at WashDOT. It's about $4.2 billion a year. And people pay a gas tax and other fees to support our agency. But when you look at the cost of what we don't get accomplished with our budget, we do a lot of good stuff. But congestion on our roads costs Washington families and Washington businesses about $2 billion a year. Potholes and the like, about $4 billion a year. Greenhouse gas, $2.3 billion a year. But crashes on our system cost Washington families and Washington businesses about $16.5 billion a year. So when you look at investment and you consider that, you know, as what would it take to raise that kind of money with a gas tax? We're paying here in Washington State about $7.50 a gallon of hidden taxes. Primarily related to safety, but also state of good repair, greenhouse gas, and congestion. So that's why this matters. And, you know, things like a 20% bump in funding, that's great. But what we really need to get this done is multiples of what we're spending today. Our system needs to be safe, and it's not. When you look at what happened during the pandemic, driving went down, crashes went up, particularly bicycle and pedestrian. People who ride and people who walk are dying in increasing numbers, and that is not acceptable. We need to take a kind of a yes and approach to safety. This is something that we've been acting on. We have adopted a safe systems approach, an approach that recognizes that you don't reduce safety just to move cars faster, that roads should be designed to encourage safe behavior, and that land use decisions should include the investments needed to safely accommodate expected transportation demand by all modes. Now, a safe systems approach, putting that in place now is certainly 20 years ago would have been great. Next best time is right now. It is going to take a lot of time, because if you look at the transportation system that I anticipate we'll have 20 years from now, a lot of it won't be a whole lot different than today, because basically all we do is our very best at maintaining stuff. We're not adding to it. We don't have the budget to. We do need to focus on vulnerable road users. We need to set speeds that lower for the potential fatalities. We need to provide safe facilities. And we need to be thinking about using technology to encourage behavior. There's a debate in the world these days. Is it safe systems? Is it complete streets? Is it V to X communication? And it's yes and. We don't need to spend time debating which way we go. We need to go forward in all of these areas. A resilient transportation system needs to be sound, and ours isn't. We are on a glide path to failure. We have better than 700 miles of pavement due or past due for preservation. We currently have the budget to do about 750 miles a year. We have a lot of bridges that need to be replaced. We're replacing 3. Over 100 steel bridges that need to be painted, not to make them pretty, but to keep them from rusting. We're painting 3. Same thing with bridge decks and ferry boats and rail track and buildings and the like. The money's just not there. When I first came on board at the agency, Connecting Washington had just been adopted. People were excited. What a great time to be Secretary of Transportation. I asked my team, what is the replacement value of the facilities we're responsible for? What should we be investing in state of good repair? What are we actually investing? We're responsible for $200 billion worth of stuff. We should be spending better than $2 billion a year just on maintenance and preservation. Prior to Move Ahead Washington, we were spending less than half that. With Move Ahead Washington, I'm excited to say that for the first time in my tenure, we're spending more than half of what we should be on maintenance and preservation, but the shortfall still approaches $1 billion a year. And that means that we will be closing bridges and reducing speeds because roads aren't safe, and tying up ferry boats and. It's not an acceptable place to be. A resilient transportation system also needs to be smart. This is kind of the fun part of this. When I was secretary, I got an email from a constituent up in Snohomish County congratulating me on my appointment, pointing out that the speed limit signs on I-5 say 60 miles an hour, and he's never able to drive 60 miles an hour on I-5. Therefore, my agency is a failure. I thanked him for his email, and I asked the team, what kind of investment would it take, hypothetically, for everyone who lives in Washington State today to be able to drive the speed limit on the interstate system anytime they wanted? It's $115 billion of investment. You may recall that the whole thing that is WashDOT is about $200 billion, $115 billion more. And to build that, we would have to raise our 49.4 cent a gallon gas tax by $2.20 to $2.50 per gallon. Now, we all know that's not going to happen. When I first put this out, everybody said, well, Millar, you pump the number up to scare us. We're usually, when we err, we usually don't err by saying it's going to cost more. But what if I'm off by 50%? That's still $1.25 a gallon. What if I'm off by 90%? And I very rarely am. If we're off by 90%, that's still 25 cents a gallon, which is better than twice the gas tax increase that the legislature has ever enacted. So solving congestion by adding capacity we've reached a point of diminishing returns. It costs more and more to make those investments, and we get less and less for the money we spend. That $2.50 a gallon, that's just the interstate. And that's just for people who live here today. It doesn't assume induced demand or growth. It doesn't assume the investment that would be needed on other state highways and local roads. It doesn't address the environmental impacts, and on and on and on. We can't do it economically. We can't do it politically. We can't do it environmentally. So let's stop trying to do it. Let's try something different. We need to make a resilient response. We need to decarbonize everything, not just autos, but decarbonizing autos is important. Transit, ferries, aviation. We do need to finish what we've started, and a lot of people get frustrated by this, but there's stuff that's in play that needs to play out in the nickel program, the Transportation Partnerships Act. This is from back in 2005. We're still building some of this stuff. Connecting Washington, we've got the Fish Passage program. That's a $4 billion initiative. Got a lot on our plate. We need to get more out of what we have through managing the system better, using technology, and through managing demand better. We need to link land use and transportation. We need to give Washingtonians affordable housing and transportation choices. I tell the legislature the single best thing you could do for our agency would be to adopt law that makes it more difficult for local governments to make bad land use decisions. We need to make it safe and easy to shift to short trips, to walk and to bike. We need to embrace telecommunity for those who can telecommute. And we need to embrace intelligent transportation systems. We're going to talk a lot this year about land use and transportation. When we look at the reduction, the potential to impact vehicle miles traveled on our system, this is something from the State Smart Transportation Initiative and Smart Growth America, an organization I used to be affiliated with. Land use makes the biggest difference. Constraining highway systems or adding transit or bike pit, parking policy, road pricing, they all impact too, but how we use our land has the single greatest potential to impact the transportation system positively or negatively. So we need to be thinking about the proximity of destinations. We need to be completing low stress multimodal networks. We need to look at context sensitive designs, solutions for our system. And we need to look at system expansion. Believe me, I am not against expanding the transportation system, but it's the transportation system, not the highway network. In the local space, we need to greatly expand a safe and direct and convenient and active transportation network. We also need at the local level and the regional level to invest heavily in public transportation. At a mega regional level, we're looking at ultra high-speed ground transportation between Eugene and Vancouver. We need to look at what's happening in the aeronautics space. Washington State has a history of aviation, a couple of small businesses that do that work. And there are emerging technologies that we need to embrace and manage. And we also need to be thinking about freight. We have another small business that's hopefully involved with package delivery, and we need to be thinking strategically about that. Now, Move Ahead Washington was adopted in the last legislative session. It's a 16-year, $17 billion transportation package. It's really important to note that one of the things Move Ahead Washington did was appropriate all of the money in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, however you want to talk about it. So when we talk about where's the money, there's state money and there's federal money, but all the federal money is incorporated into the 16-year, $17 billion package in Washington, with the exception of the discretionary grant funds that come because you can't appropriate money that you haven't earned yet. So we're making historic investments in ferries and buses and electric vehicle infrastructure and transit and active transportation. We did that without increasing the gas tax. We used Climate Commitment Act funding, cap and invest money. We used the federal dollars. There was a one-time transfer from the state general fund, and there were some license and fee increases. So $1.5 billion for Washington State Ferries is a good thing, stabilizing our operations and electrifying the fleet. $1.3 billion in active transportation investments. That's a huge lift. $3 billion in transit programs and investments there. $2.8 billion towards preservation and maintenance. A good down payment, but we've got a ways to go. $2.4 billion for fish. $150 million to move the ultra high-speed ground transportation work forward. $50 million for connecting communities. We funded Washington's portion of the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project. and some favorite projects of legislators and business groups and others around the state. They're on the list, including completing the 520 project, which will provide a direct transit connection between East Side communities and South Lake Union, and an incredible multimodal network. The shared use path, when it's done, is going to be great. And the 167-509 work down in the Gateway, including multi-use paths between Puyallup and Fife and Tacoma, and hopefully connecting up to the National Park and elsewhere in the region. So a lot of stuff going on. So one of the things in Connecting Washington in the Move Ahead Washington package was a complete streets requirement. Basically directs the DOT to incorporate complete streets principles into any project we start on after July 1, 2022, that's over 500,000, which is essentially any project we do. So what we've directed the team to do, if you're working on a project and within your project limits, there is a gap in our award-winning active transportation plan, fill that gap. If there's not a gap in the state network, check with your local partners. If there's a gap in their network that's in their adopted plan, fill that gap. And that is my encouragement for local communities to develop active transportation plans, so we know where the gaps in the networks are. And if there is no gap in the state plan or no gap in the local plan, before our project managers can say, hey, we don't have to do anything else, are you in a disadvantaged community? So if your project's in a disadvantaged community, they may have not had the wherewithal, financially or politically, to do any active transportation planning. So do that work, identify the gaps, and go. I think this is going to make a substantial difference. There are some folks that are grousing that, well, we won't be able to do as much highway paving in terms of preservation work. Absolutely not. But these investments in walking facilities and bicycling facilities are going to save lives and help us manage demand for the system. It's a really, really good way to go. Hoping that other states will follow our lead in this space. So we are implementing our active transportation plan 2020 and beyond. It is a compass for creating a future for walking and biking and rolling on or across our facilities. We're using it in decision making, including all of our complete streets work. I encourage you, if you don't have a copy, download it. We are also one of 12 finalists for AASHTO's 2022 America's Transportation Awards. If we win the People's Choice Award, which we would win if enough people vote for us, so use that QR code, vote every day for our project, and you can vote once a day on as many devices as you have. That goes on until about 9 p.m. on the 21st of October. If we win, we get a $10,000 award, which we will split between Disability Rights Washington, Bicycling Community, and our Memorial Foundation. So get out there, vote early and often, and thank you for taking the time to do that. So one last thing to talk about is these investments create jobs. And I point out to my friends in labor that bicycle projects and pedestrian projects create a lot more jobs per dollar spent than car-only road projects, about 46% more jobs per dollar spent. And preservation work creates 16% more jobs per dollar spent than new road construction. Transit work creates 31%. So if you're making the pitch for investment on a jobs basis, pitch walking and biking and public transportation. So I'll wrap up my talk in Etcha and hopefully have a chance to talk with you a little bit. We continue to rethink our old models. It's really important to note there are two things I don't do as Secretary of Transportation. I don't write state policy and I don't appropriate money. That's done by our governor and our legislature. We are subject matter experts and implementers. So people love to throw WashDOT under the bus. The stuff we're building that you don't like, we were directed to do it. And so, yeah, that's what we do. But as subject matter experts, we are working with our partners and stakeholders in the transportation space to recommend new solutions. We're re-examining how we use our infrastructure so that it accommodates all people and all modes. We want to make sure our policy and program decisions are equitable and inclusive. We want to adapt our transportation investment strategies to the modern work environment. Here we are 22 years into the 21st century, and we're still making decisions based on a 19th century agrarian calendar. Maybe we should do something different there. We need to emphasize resilience in what we do and select flexible and adaptable strategies that can move us forward in this uncertain future. So thanks for listening to me. I'm going to stop sharing and stay for questions.
All right. Thank you, Roger. And thanks to all of you who've dropped into the chat who you are, where you're from. Please keep adding questions into the chat. And I'll get us rolling with a few, really to put some context on our work. I'd ask how the new direction from the legislature and Move Ahead Washington compares to what other state DOTs are expected to do.
It's a great question. Other DOTs, it varies. Again, I work for Governor Inslee, and I work at the direction of the state legislature of the state of Washington. That's very different if I had this job in Idaho or Wyoming or elsewhere. There are states like Washington where most of the money spent on transportation is raised in the state. You know, about 15% of our funding is federal. Other states, better than half of their funding is federal, and a lot of them are looking at a more traditional approach to investing in cars and trucks. But I think looking around the country, you know, of the 52 DOTs, the 50 states plus the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, you have agencies like ours. I think Caltrans, Oregon, Minnesota, Massachusetts, you know, looking around Vermont. There are places that are doing some really cool stuff. There are places that are doing some more traditional stuff. One of the things I'm excited about is I'm going to Florida later this month. And while I'm there at the AASHTO conference, I anticipate I will become the president of AASHTO and be representing the organization for the next year. And what you just saw is essentially my program for AASHTO going forward.
Fantastic. Since we're meeting with a group of folks, some in local agencies, some advocates, and you touched on this, but maybe you have a couple more thoughts about what would improve active transportation connections that isn't something we control, but that local agencies and advocates can help create.
Oh, goodness. Well, you know, first of all, land use decisions. So many cities and counties approve subdivisions in spaces, and those subdivisions internally, they work internally. They have roundabouts and they have separated bike paths and they have sidewalks and all the rest of that stuff. And then they drain out onto a farm to market highway that WashDOT built 50 years ago. And it doesn't even have a wide shoulder on it. And they approve that development without insisting on the investment to connect it safely to the rest of the world for people who get around other than driving cars. So I think what local government and local advocates can do is advocate for smart land use decision making and advocate for conditions of approval that require a safe multimodal connection, not just a stop sign and a stop bar. That's one. And I think a huge one. I think, you know, in the land use space, making it easy to do the right thing. Right now, the easiest thing for a developer to do, the thing that provides the greatest certainty in terms of investment and return on investment of your dollars, is to take a green field and make a Dinger single family subdivision out of it. Going downtown, going mixed use, going multifamily is riskier. And a lot of the risk is related to regulation. And we could do a lot to clean that up. I think we could also look at local governments considering complete streets policies like WashDOT's complete streets policy and go ahead and make those investments. You know, I live in Olympia, And there's some debate about that. Well, we can't use that money for sidewalks because that's not transport. Yes, you can if city councils and city planning commissions decide it's a priority.
We're a little over time. Do you have time for maybe 2 more short questions?
Here as long as you need me.
Staying with the local transportation decisions, this is a techie question, but are you recommending that the local agencies develop lists of prioritized gaps in their network and include those projects in their tips?
Yes, do an active transportation plan. My goodness. Funding comes to plans. We did a plan, look, funding came to it. It generally, that's the way that happens. If you want to see investment, you have to plan for it. We've just directed all of our people, when we're doing a project and a local government comes to us and says, boy, we want this and this and this and this, is it in your plan? Or are you just piling on? I want the investment to be logical. I want the investment to be implementing a vision that a community sets for itself. And so, yeah, develop those plans, fund them. That's how you get stuff done.
And I'll ask a question that has you put on your hat as one of the people on the board for the Traffic Safety Commission about the Target Zero plan, which is going to be heading towards an update, I think in the next year. As it stands now, it's had almost no acknowledgement of the underlying role of land use in traffic safety. So what could you do from your position to help change that?
Well, I need to work with the other people on the commission. I'm one member. The governor's got a representative on the commission, as does the state patrol, and Chief Batiste is there. But most of the commission represent local government and the courts and the public health and others. We need to have a more robust discussion at that table about land use, about safe systems design, about electronic enforcement of speeding and stuff like that. And when you look at all the electronic enforcement stuff, I am very concerned about the equity impacts of technology, and I'm very concerned about privacy impacts of technology. There are people in the equity community and the privacy community that look at people in the technology community and say, bring us a rock. And they bring a rock. I don't like that rock. Bring me another rock. Why don't we sit down together and address the safety issues along with the equity issues and the privacy and civil rights issues? We're asking for permission from the legislature to do automatic speed enforcement in our construction zones. People are dying in our work zones, and that's just not right. So, but it shouldn't be, are we investing in technology or are we investing in safe systems, or what? We should be investing in all of that. We should have stronger requirements to get a driver's license. How about continuing ed on the licensing side? And we need to have an investment in enforcement. But from our perspective, a great big piece of it is how we design and build what we do. We are taking that safe systems approach, but like I said, it's going to take a long time as we go through the cycles of preservation and improvement to our system. It's going to take a long time for the safe systems approach to get to every street corner in Washington.
I'm seeing a thumbs up for continuing ed requirements for driver's licenses. There are a lot of questions coming in, and I know you have other things on your schedule, and we're rolling into another session that's about how to get some of the money that Roger mentioned. So what I will do at this point is I'll put my email in the chat, invite people to email me, and we'll capture these questions out of chat, and I will do some follow-up, drop some links in. There's questions about things like, how do you know that many jobs are created? And I know there's research, and we can share a link to that research. And I'll refer them to my partners in the Rail Freight Ports division for a question about rail lines. So there's a lot of great questions here. I really appreciate your time being with us, Roger. And I know you have lots more you could share with them if we could spend all day.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you all for what you do. I very much appreciate it. Keep us on our toes and stay safe out there.
sorry to be the bearer of bad news and say, no, he can't answer every question, that lots of great questions. And I will do what I can to answer some of them. I skipped the one about money because that's this next workshop. So I'm going to roll into that now. I'll invite my fellow speakers to come on camera as we start, just to let folks see that you're all here. So I know you're all here. And I am going to do a screen share. And there's always that moment where you want to make sure you're sharing the right screen. So you should be seeing a screen that says, show us the money and how to get it.
No, it's your desktop currently.
Can't see, why is that?
It's a very nice picture.
Thank you. I highlighted.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. That's the PDF. And I clicked. Now I'm looking to see if can I see that little box highlighting. Zoom operates differently than the other one.
Yeah. Okay. Show us the money. There you go.
The blue flowers are gone. Okay. Awesome. Sorry. I do like those blue flowers. So we are going to fly pretty quickly through slides and get to some interactive things. So if you need to stretch and get your coffee, you'll know who the speakers are as we do our portion of this set of slides. I'm going to lead off with some things about the funding for Active Transportation Division, and Roger mentioned Connecting Community or Move Ahead Washington and the Climate Commitment Act dollars. My colleague Evan Olson from Public Transportation Division will be doing some slides on some of the grants that you may not have thought of as funding active transportation contributions and improvements, but they can. Darren Buck and Joel Barnett are joining us from FHWA to talk about the federal funding. We've got a couple of folks who should be logged on in the chat. I didn't look in the participant list, but WashDOT is not the only entity that gives funding out at the state level. And so as you drop questions in, they might be ones for another agency as well. And so I'm hoping I've got my helpers in Q&A, and if not, we'll track them down later. And operating PDF is different than operating PowerPoint. So I just told you what we're going to do as far as speakers. We will then, I'm going to share some questions to ask yourself to think your way through your project. There's a federal resource that we've sort of echoed as a state resource. Sorry, I have a broken wrist, so I'm having a really hard time running my mouse with my right hand. And a timeline for state funding, and ask you if those are the kinds of resources you need from us to find your way through. And then we're going to ask you, tell us something you want to be able to do. Is it you want to build a sidewalk, you want to connect a trail, some of that. And then collectively, we'll just sort of think out loud. None of us are making funding commitments in this. This is all hypothetical, but say, oh, you could look here, here, and here. Here's the ways that you could maybe consider putting together grants from more than one source. So that's our plan for the format. Roger mentioned the Move Ahead Washington funding, and this graphic gives you a picture of what's happening with Climate Commitment Act dollars. We have a 16-year total with over $4 billion dedicated directly to public transportation and to active transportation. And that is more funding than we've ever had for those categories. So exciting time to be doing this work. For all of these, the underlying funding comes from the Climate Commitment Act. And the thing that we will need to stay focused on as an agency is, as we use those dollars, the statute requires us to make sure that we commit at least 35% and preferably a goal of 40% to provide direct and meaningful benefits to vulnerable populations in overburdened communities. We have to do 10% at least of tribal benefits, and that can be within the 35 to 40. So we're doing a lot of tracking here. And that applies to all these grants. And so some of this is things you should think about for your project. Some of it is things we'll think about on the back end. It's a little bit different program to program. The statutes have definitions of these things, and I've put on the screen some of the elements. It's all worded as includes, but is not limited to. So you knowing your community and what it means to be vulnerable and not have access to transportation is really important information. It's certainly the kinds of human characteristics that have had disadvantages in the past, have had a disproportionate burden from past transportation projects. So those communities and people who have been highly impacted by fossil fuels, by climate change, by emissions from transportation, those kinds of things. In active transportation, they expanded funding in existing programs and added some new programs. They also increased some funding to the TIB for their Complete Streets grants. And there is a project list of pedestrian and bicyclist projects that went straight to the legislature that are being funded as well. To give you a quick fly through of what's new or different or bigger in our programs in the Active Transportation Division, some of you may be familiar with Safe Routes to School and the Pedestrian Bicyclist Program. If you compare our call for projects this year to two years ago for the last one, it essentially triples it. That's a combination of existing state funding and federal funding, and then the new Climate Commitment Act dollars. We were always telling people it was highly competitive, so that if you submitted, your chances were maybe 1 in 4, 1 in 5. Well, now there's a lot more money. There's a lot more applications for much more money. So your chances are still 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. But it's exciting to know that we'll have those kinds of dollars year after year. And you can start catching up on some of that backlog. We will be sending our list to the legislature as we do before each biennial budget. That rank orders the projects and says as far down as you can go, that's how many we'll fund. We're going to, at their invitation, propose a line that is us providing expanded technical assistance and supporting more development of local plans. As Roger mentioned, there are places that just haven't been able to do one. And the idea has been floated of supporting plan development in those overburdened communities that don't have one yet. The thing to know about these programs is that 60% of our evaluation relies on safety and equity. So if you're ignoring safety or equity, your chances of funding are less than 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. In all of these programs, also, I should have mentioned, we will be consulting with the Environmental Justice Council and getting their recommendations. So what I'm describing to you now is us racing towards our December 1st finish line for this first round of reports. And then over time, as we have the chance to have that consultation, then we might see some evolution, some new ideas about how we more fully address environmental justice concerns. The Connecting Communities pilot, I saw a question in the chat for Roger about this one. This one isn't a grant, that it wasn't structured that way in the legislation. It has a long list of criteria that we need to address to identify the locations where the active transportation network is not whole because of legacy state transportation facilities. And that word legacy means to us that it's both the currently operating state routes and then also any of those that were turned over to local jurisdictions to function as a local road. Probably turned over looking a lot like a state highway, right? So we are doing a GIS analysis now with some consultants to help us do this quickly, identify those places that rank high on all of the various criteria, and then we'll contact those communities and say, are you a willing partner? What do you need? Do you already have a plan? Do you already have projects submitted on that very stretch of road that we could fund? So we're looking also at past applications to our grant programs, other ways people have identified a need that relates to a state route. And I should mention that's a 5-year, $50 million pilot. That sounds like a lot of money, but boy, it'll go fast because there is a lot of need. Exciting one that I just want to touch on until you talk to Cascade if you're interested, and that is a really much expanded statewide bike and safety education program that's school-based for every grade level from elementary through high school. And the legislation gave us the criteria for how to select our nonprofit partner, that's Cascade. And they will be then working with school districts, with community organizations that work with youth that want to partner on both school-based and after-school programs. So again, talk to Cascade, because if you ask us if you can have a piece of this, we will send you to Cascade. So just cut out the middleman there. And very excited to see this get started. And that also will have a report that goes to the legislature that explains the process and how schools are being selected. And again, that legislation directed us to prioritize those overburdened communities. So you'll see that again and again and again. But wait, there's more. Roger mentioned the Complete Streets Design Directive and the importance of updating your plans so that as we come through with a paver or another kind of project, then you will have a plan that we can sync up with. Those pedestrian bicyclist projects that communities submitted directly, that wasn't a grant application. That's not a, screened and prioritized in any way. It's just a list of projects. And so the legislature asked us to put those into tiers by how they serve overburdened communities. So we'll be doing that. And TIB Complete Streets grants were expanded, and you need a Complete Streets ordinance to be eligible for those. A couple of contact pages, and if you were to screenshot that QR code, no, it won't take you to our contact information. It takes you to voting for the Active Transportation Plan and the People's Choice Award. We're putting that everywhere. We have 4 of us in the Central Division, and then a more important screen to capture is the region active transportation contacts. And I will drop all of those into chat as well. So if you have a question about a specific stretch of state highway crossings, or what are you going to be doing, or when's the paver coming through, those kinds of things, you can connect with these folks in your region. And with that, my pretty slide of a floating bus island and somebody loading a bike onto a bus is to tell you that it's time for my colleague Evan Olson to turn his camera on and be ready to present. And I will be running the slides for Evan.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Evan Olson. The role I play in our WashDOT Public Transportation Division is as the grant supervisor. We're a team of 4 right now, quickly expanding to 7. And after the next couple of slides, you will definitely see why that is happening. But just before I begin all of that, just a little bit about the Public Transportation Division. While our main focus is public transportation, we acknowledge that the entire system doesn't work as well as it could if we're not partnering with other modes to improve the system. So we focus on making sure that people get to where they need to go, and that can be for medical trips, school, jobs, or anything like a recreational activity. And of course, we do this in partnership with others. Here's the Move Ahead Washington funding table for transit. If you do recall from earlier, transit is expected to get $3 billion over the 16 years, which is a massive expansion for us that we're really excited about. What that's going to do for us is that funds a lot of our existing programs and gives them a boost to their traditional funding levels, but it also creates some new programs for us. And of course, the $3 billion, I should say, is if all the revenue from the cap and trade comes through as fully realized. It may take some time to get there, but this is what we are expecting. Go ahead. So what this means for our grant programs is that we are going to have some changes to it. In addition to the amounts that we're expecting to get through the Move Ahead Washington, we also got an unexpected bump in our supplemental awards for the 2021-2023 legislative cycle. That's an additional $53.5 million for those 5 programs you see there. The ones that are not marked as new are our existing programs, and then we had 2 new programs that we had to implement very quickly, since those funds do expire at the end of June 30 of 2023. So 2 of the brand new programs in 23-25, we have the State Bus and Bus Facilities Program, and that is a capital program for transit. We are expecting up to $37.5 million for that program. And the secondary program there is a Tribal Transit Mobility Grant Program, so up to $10 million per biennium for that program. To implement the tribal transit, we are incorporating that into our Consolidated grant program, which is a pretty long-standing program we have. And so if people would like to access those funds, we are guiding them to apply for our Consolidated grant program, which is currently accepting applications right now. So change our grant. Go ahead and skip the one after this, Barb. Because as Barb mentioned before, there are changes with the new requirement for the vulnerable populations from the Climate Commitment Act. This means that in order to get our grant programs aligned with that new requirement, we had to make some changes pretty quickly. And the first part of that was to start adding some questions. We changed our application process to make sure that we could implement the new requirements. The new question that we asked was, where is the project occurring? And which populations will you be impacting with that project? So if it's a project that's operating, what is the service area? And if it's capital, where do you plan to implement that capital asset? To do this data analysis, we will be using the recommended Department of Health Washington Tracking Network. I'll talk about that in a little bit because it does have some data layers that are helpful for us. There is another requirement as part of this that Barb mentioned with our tribes, and it specifically says that 10% has to go to tribes. And as for projects, though, if there is a project that supports a tribe, it does have to have a tribal resolution along with it. And we do know that that can actually take a little bit of time to actually get one of those resolutions. So in the interim, what we're requesting from applicants is that they provide some kind of documentation, whether that be a contract that currently exists to provide that service, maybe a memorandum of understanding, or some kind of letter of support that demonstrates that the tribe acknowledges that the project is there and that they do support it. So because of all the new funding we got from the supplemental budget, that meant that public transportation was one of the first divisions that had to try to implement these new requirements. Other people like the Environmental Justice Council are working with other state agencies currently to develop some longer term guidance that will help us. What we've done so far is some interim guidance that we are using and that we will adopt the Environmental Justice Council's recommended guidance when they have that available to us. What we've done is we use the Washington Tracking Network. As I mentioned before, we are taking a look at the data layer, the environmental health disparities, and that actually overlays the vulnerable populations, and it also references that with the environmental harms that occur in geographic locations. So we're using this as a temporary way to guide our decisions in funding. So that's a little bit of like kind of the overview of our program so far, but let's dive a little bit deeper into specific programs where there could be some nexus with active transportation. The program that's probably most obvious for us in public transportation is our Regional Mobility Grant Program. And this program focuses on two main priorities. One, the projects have to improve connectivity between areas, and the other is they reduce transportation delay. This program is specifically eligible for cities, counties, ports, and public transportation agencies. And one of the main metrics that we use to score this is there a reduction in vehicle trips and vehicle miles traveled? Go ahead and go to the next slide. And so here's the part where I think it might be most helpful. So within this particular program, this can be for operating or capital or transportation demand management. And each of these categories or columns represents a project type that we have within the program. I've highlighted some areas that are in tan that when I looked at them, they were the most obvious that we could have some alignment with active transportation. So when I look at things like under the vehicle and equipment purchases column, the multi-level enhancements, many of our partners in transit, when they are sometimes purchasing vehicles, they are requesting bicycle racks to go on the front. This is sometimes one of those kind of quick grabs, the low-hanging fruit that can have a nexus with active transportation. In the capital construction column, we have things like bus shelters, platforms, and stations. And if your plan is to develop those yourselves, and if you're a city, county, or port, you can do that yourself. But it might also be a really great idea to partner with a transit agency or a city that is already doing these things and talking to them about what kind of infrastructure you might need. Of course, now looking at this, I see others as well in this column. There is parking ride lots and facilities at the bottom of this list. That's also a really good one. Sometimes there might be a need for some bike racks or some other bike infrastructure at park and rides. Looking at the operations, actually skip over the operations column to the transportation demand management. That is probably the biggest area where we see some crossover. Programs that encourage a mode shift to high efficiency modes. We've seen a lot of success in this area where people are recommending active transportation as a way to, as another mode besides driving alone. Also those first and last mile connections, and that could be something, whether that's an operation that helps make that connection, or maybe it's infrastructure as well that helps get people to connect that first and that last mile. And then the last part there is the other transportation demand management strategies and concepts. If you haven't taken a look at that transportation systems management and operations website, it's a really good walkthrough to see what kind of strategies you can use for transportation demand management. And there's a link within that that talks about active transportation that should be pretty helpful. Go ahead. Just a real quick slide to mention that if this is something that has piqued your interest, it's a little too late this year to apply since we're already scoring for the 23-25 cycle. But this is a great opportunity, though, to do planning and get ready for the next cycle in 25-27. We will begin taking pre-applications in February of 2024. So start the planning process now. The other grant program we have that there might be some crossover is our Consolidated grant program. This particular program is really focused on providing connections between rural communities and providing access to other services. It's also really focused on persons who are transportation disadvantaged. So people who are lower income, older Americans, and over 65, younger Americans, under the age of 18, persons with disabilities, and as I mentioned, people in rural areas, making those connections. That I say is probably one of the biggest caveats to being a part of this consolidated grant program, is that it does have to kind of meet one of those subgroups and provide service to them. This is all about providing access. This is about providing access to jobs, education, or other rural connections, so people can do shopping, things like that. And the eligible applicants are people like nonprofits, tribes, our public transportation agencies, and local agencies like cities and counties. This particular grant program is currently open right now, with applications quickly coming up at the end of this month. A big part of this requirement, though, is that you do have to work with your regional transportation planning organization to make sure that you are a part of the Coordinated Public Transit Human Services Transportation Plan. Please email me if you have questions about that process, because it can get kind of sticky. So if you're interested in that, please give me a call. And here's some areas for possible partnerships. So while you are not eligible for this particular, or you may not be eligible for this particular grant program, there are opportunities that you might want to partner. Our brand new grant program that is being developed for the 23-25 biennium is our state buses and bus facilities. This is a capital program for our transit agencies in Washington state. And similar to what I was mentioning in the regional mobility grant program, is that if people are building infrastructure, your transit partners, that might be a really great way to work with them and ask if they're planning on any kind of active transportation elements as part of those projects. As you can see here, this is about replacement of rolling stock. So bus racks could be an option there. This is about construction or rehabilitation of a transit facility, a transit hub, an administrative building. So any of those things are eligible with this particular program. Go ahead. And lastly, we'll stop with some resources here. So if anyone has questions about any of our grant programs, I advise you to take a look at our web pages we have there. All of our grant pages have separate links to them. We also have a link to a timeline of all of our grants when they open and close, so you can help prepare for that. If you want to contact anyone within our division, there is a comprehensive list of everyone and the programs that they're responsible for. And then lastly, if you're interested in diving into the data side of things and how we're going to be doing our analysis internally, take a look at the Washington Tracking Network from the Department of Health. It's got some really interesting layers to parse through the vulnerable populations and the overburdened communities. And with that, I will pass it on to our next partners here.
Oh, there we go. And with that, Darren, take it away. I skipped straight to the disclaimer. Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Darren Buck. I am with Federal Highways headquarters, though I'm based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. I work in our Office of Human Environment on bicycle pedestrian projects on our livability team. I consider myself something of an advocate, I suppose, for walking and bicycling. Next slide, please. And I'll just read the disclaimer and then pass off to Joel to talk about our formula programs. Except for any statutes or regulations cited. The contents of this presentation do not have a force and effect of law and are not meant to benefit the states or the public in any way. This presentation is intended only to provide information regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. All right, and with that, I will pass it off to Joel to talk first about our formula programs, and then I'm going to talk about discretionary programs and wrap up with a few sort of brief other resources that might be helpful for everyone. Joel?
Great, thanks, Darren. Hey, my name is Joel Barnett. I'm the Safety and Design Engineer here at the Washington Division. Also, part of that is the Bike and Pedestrian Program Manager for the federal side of the programs for transportation alternatives, et cetera, here at the division. So if you have any questions, concerns regarding the bike ped program at the federal level, and especially how it's applied in Washington State, please feel free to reach out and contact me. I'm happy to engage. So on that note, we'll just jump straight into this, and I'll try to whip right through the formula side of the conversation. It's primarily administered by the state, and some of these funds are going to be passed on to local agencies, and I'll try to point out where those intersections occur. So of course, HSIP funding is right out of the gate is probably the largest program that intersects with bike and pedestrian funding. There was an increase in bill about 34% at the nationwide level. For funds for fiscal year 2022, the apportionment for WashDOT was 50.8 million, or about 51 million. So you'll probably see Washington State or WashDOT sees that amount in a little bit elevated fashion throughout fiscal year 2026. You can skip to the next slide. So as part of HSIP, in terms of the changes within bill, probably the one that impacts bike and pedestrians the most is the vulnerable road user special rule. The rule basically states that states must dedicate 15% of HSIP funding to safety projects that address VRU, fatalities, and serious injuries. Fatalities and serious injuries is it's based on fatalities, but we always want to address both of those, right? And so if the state's number of VRU traffic fatalities is greater to or greater than 50% of the total state fatalities in a single year, then we'll get into then they get into that 15% of funding going towards those VRU fatalities and serious injuries, or just essentially going towards projects that address those. Just to kind of throw out some stats on that real quick, the state of Washington in 2020 was at 22%. 21 for calendar year 21 was at 24%, and then based on the most recent statistics, we have about 18% for 2022. So we're continuing to see, though it's starting to reset itself, we saw a bunch of COVID pandemic related fatalities kind of increase throughout there. And that's it in the nationwide level too. So, all right, you can skip to the next slide. And so the next program is transportation alternatives set aside from the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. Just to whip through that real quick, we have it increases funding, setting it at 10% of the total STPG for each fiscal year, increases from 50 to 59% the portion that must be suballocated based on population. It continues to permit states to transfer that funds out of TA and up to 50%, and then allows states to use up to 5% of available funds. So, you know, the Transportation Alternatives programs really intersects with Barb's bike and pedestrian program, and how active transportation goes into that. And so definitely, if you have any questions, this is a state administered program, so they select the projects. So please reach out to Barb and her group to discuss how you may be able to get involved in the project selection process for that. So you can skip to the next slide. And then Cmac is another legacy program out there. It is some of the changes that are along with that is it adds eligibility to shared micromobility, so bike share, e-scooters, etc. Purchase of diesel replacements, zero emission vehicles. It actually increases so fiscal year 2022 Cmac was 40.2 million. So there's some money available in there. And so again, reach out to the WashDOT to discuss how to get involved in the project selection for that as well. If they do, I'm not sure. I'm not a Cmac program manager, so I'm going to be honest with you. So I'm not sure exactly how they administer that program, but please, if you have any questions about it, you can reach out to me and I will definitely track that down to who you need to speak to at the state. You can skip over that. All right, and Bridge Formula Program. This is another formula program out there, really addresses the deficiency in our bridge system that we have. So really provides benefits for off-system bridge projects. 15% of the funds are reserved for those. 100, and also allows for 100% federal share owned by a local agency. So there's a lot of, or federally recognized tribe, and so there's a lot of benefits in doing that. So please feel free to reach out to me, or Lauren Wilson is our bridge engineer. I can get you in contact with him if you have any questions about that particular program, and we can get you to the state for that. So next slide. And then our carbon reduction program, another new program out there from Bill, provides $6.4 billion of funding and contract authority from the Highway Transportation Fund, and it's basically just a program to reduce funding, and it increases, and it also allows for active transportation projects that are geared towards reducing that carbon footprint that seems to be out there. So go ahead, or is out there. I didn't mean to see seems, by the way. And then I'll go ahead and kick it over to Darren, and he'll talk about the fund programs that are out there, specifically Safe Streets for All. So go ahead.
All right, thanks a lot, Joel. I did very selfishly save some of the fun ones for myself. Safe Streets and Roads for All. I'm sure many of you in the audience might have been involved in what was probably a brutal sprint to get a responsive application in for this. This is a program that supports local initiatives, only local, through grants to prevent death and serious injury on streets. We have a very generic moniker for what many of you probably call a Vision Zero plan that may identify a high injury network. It's $5 billion is authorized for this, along with a possible additional billion to reach $6 billion over 5 fiscal years. That grant round that just closed back in September was the first round. Next slide, please. Eligible activities. I actually wrote this down and wrote it in bold print. I'm sorry you can't see that, from when Secretary Millar mentioned that funding comes from plans. Eligible activities for funding: developing a comprehensive safety action plan, conduct planning, design, and development activities. That's a 40% set aside of $1 billion a year. So that's $400 million in planning, analysis, design, development activities that are available for local entities to basically figure out a Vision Zero plan and responsive projects that will help you get to zero. So that's an important thing, I think, to emphasize in that program, that this is a great opportunity for communities to get out there and do some planning that you might not otherwise be able to do as you're responding to the day-to-day. All activities, such as projects that you may apply for under the same program, to say refurbish a corridor, they all have to be somehow connected to an action plan, and it funds activities, again, most likely to significantly reduce or eliminate fatalities and serious injuries involving various road users. I would advise folks to search for something called a CMF, a crash modification factor. Those are analytical studies that identify what the safest countermeasures are to help safety. And for walking and bicycling, there's plenty of them, including bike lanes, sidewalks, RRFB beacons, hawks, roundabouts as pictured here, et cetera. There's lots of options available to improve vulnerable road user safety. Next slide, please. Reconnecting Communities. You've probably heard a whole lot about this one. I believe that the grant period for this might have closed recently or is closing soon. It's hard to keep track with so many grant programs going out. This one is obviously, it's a big deal. It's about restoring community connectivity by removing, retrofitting, or trying to mitigate how transportation facilities in the past have created barriers within communities, divided communities, or otherwise inhibited mobility and access in those communities. And it's $1 billion of funding over 5 years, both for planning or possible construction. Next slide, please. And I wanted to highlight, this is all heading towards something. I wanted to highlight another program that was authorized in our bipartisan infrastructure law, but not yet appropriated. and that's the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, or ATIP. We love our acronyms. It's to construct eligible projects or conduct planning studies, again, to provide safe and connected active transportation facilities in an active transportation network. That network, that's a very key phrase, or active transportation spine, which is defined in the legislation as a active transportation facility that is connecting to communities with existing networks. So it's $1 billion authorized over 5 years, subject to appropriations. It hasn't yet been appropriated, but both the Senate and the House have in their draft appropriations bills for FY23 varying amounts to fund this program for the first time. So we just want you to pay attention to the headlines on this. It would fund either planning or capital construction grants for those types of activities. Next slide, please. Neighborhood access and equity. This is so brand new that I didn't even want to go too far off of the official talking points to talk too much about this, but it's been authorized by a separate piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act. It funded for $3 billion this neighborhood and access and equity plan. And the best shorthand I can give it is that it's very similar to the Reconnecting Communities pilot program that I described before, the one about sort of mending the disconnection between communities that transportation facilities in the past have wrought, and the active transportation infrastructure program that I just mentioned in the last slide. It talks about reconnecting communities over transportation facilities and developing active transportation networks within those communities. It is authorized at $3 billion over, I believe, 4 to 5 years. A notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO as we call it, has not gone out for this. And I don't know what the timeline is for that, but that is another one to keep a very close eye out for. Next slide, please. Prioritization process pilot program. This is one intended mostly for states and MPOs, your regional planning organizations. It's grants to develop and implement publicly accessible and transparent prioritization processes for selection of progress or projects statewide. Next slide. Again, as we're talking about sort of planning and network access, this is another pilot program called the Transportation Access Pilot to develop sort of an open source accessibility data set and provide that data to organizations that do system level planning to be able to enable those entities to improve transportation planning by measuring the access of how easy it is for your residents to get to the places and the things that they need to access within the system. It's again, this is another pilot program. I do not know the timeline for getting that executed, but that's another one to keep an eye out for. Next slide, please. This is your this is your reminder to get your eyes checked. If like me, this is a newly released pedestrian and bicycle funding opportunities chart, and I will drop a direct link into the chat. This is something our office puts out every time there's a new transportation authorization. Along the vertical, you will see every conceivable walking or bicycling related project that you might be want to fund with federal funding. And across the horizontal, you will see almost every federal program that we know of within USDOT that may be able to be used to fund that particular type of walking and bicycling project. It is very detailed. It is very in the weeds. But go ahead, and if you're ever really curious about it, please click through to the link and check it out. Next slide, please. Just a few things underway in our office. One is a new toolkit, or it's not that new at this point, about active transportation funding and financing. It's sort of a toolkit to walk you through using non-federal sources of funding to, say, come up with a match for federal funding, or other sources to be able to to fund your project. A couple of things we're working on are some new guidance on crosswalk markings, e-bikes, getting our dipping our toe in e-bikes and how they are being used in new ways. One project I am working on personally, separated bike lanes on higher speed roads. We have WSDOT folks represented on our technical advisory panel to help encourage system owners to think about separated bike lanes on these contexts. And accessibility is a very important thing around the department these days. And thinking about accessibility beyond mere ADA compliance and thinking about how the safety of a lot of these new and quick build pedestrian and bicycle type facilities, we need to ensure that they're accessible so that people who are blind or may use a wheelchair or walker, etc., get the full safety benefit of these innovative new designs that we're putting out more and more. Next slide, please. Just a few links for more information. I did want to drop a link as well into something called the Thriving Communities Initiative. So Thriving Communities is another thing that was authorized by legislation. It is not a grant program for projects. It is for technical assistance. And very soon, that program will be soliciting for community-based organizations to provide technical assistance to help communities plan, apply for, and win funding for community-based transportation projects. There are 3 technical assistance tracks that I don't remember offhand, but I would urge folks both to keep an eye out if you are an organization that is looking to provide technical assistance, or if you are a community that could use sort of that deep dive assistance in conducting planning. Please keep an eye out for that. And all of that, they have a technical assistance webpage, the administration does, called DOT Navigator, and most of the resources along with the NOFO will be housed there. So please keep an eye out for that. And I think that's it for me. Next slide, just to make sure. There we go.
Indeed. So you've heard a lot, and there are a lot of intersecting and overlapping and possibly confusing timelines and requirements. I dropped a few questions into the chat, and apologies if that ends up making sort of a disconnected thing, but I was just looking at the clock and wanting to make sure we have time to talk through some of the kinds of questions that come up. What I've done is compile a few questions to think about for a project or an activity that you want to fund. And because I am amazingly affectionate about alliteration, these all start with a P. So place, people, plans, and projects. And I think this helps you organize that information to think about whether you're applying for a state fund, going out looking for philanthropic dollars. I know that's gone into some of the trails we have. So I dropped these into the chat, and I don't want to read all over the screens because I think if you have a project, you're already kind of thinking about these things, but understanding the place. And obviously for our state funding, that includes, do I know whether I'm in an overburdened community? And I understand that that will affect the competitiveness under some of the buckets. Is there something special about this time, this place? Maybe there's some leveraging opportunities, and I hope we can explore those with some of the project examples folks have. If I got federal dollars from Safe Streets and Roads for All to do a safety action plan, and now I'm going to apply for a Safe Routes to School grant. Yep, that counts. You're in a plan. So think about how these work together. For people, knowing who you're going to serve and how you know that. And you will see, I think if you look through both the state and federal legislation, you'll see a lot of emphasis on really authentic engagement in the community, and not the old days were design, display, defend. Like, we already know what we're going to do, tell us you love it. Listening to the community and what they need and what their priorities are and how they need to get places. And if you're not benefiting vulnerable populations, again, just recognizing that that there's still funds that are not tied to that. You still have an opportunity for funding. It's just an additional competitiveness factor for some dollars. In your plans, be in all the plans. And in particular, I'd say please plan for your state route. So when we come through, we know what you want. And on the project, are you designing good projects? And our tiny team in the Active Transportation Division, right now they're working on site reviews for the last round of applications to our grant programs. But in between call for project cycles, they do a lot of technical assistance. We will be adding to our team and have a little bit more capacity for that. So very excited. And I dropped a few links in for some of these resources that we've developed, some of those with FHWA help. So thank you for that. Our pedestrian safety, safe transportation for every pedestrian crossing information. And we were part of a pilot looking at route directness, which you could think of as the pedestrian detour. How far out of your way do you need to go to get to a good crossing? So are you planning for crossings where they're needed? So with that, you saw the big matrix from Joel and Darren of every kind of thing you might think about funding. I've created the starting point with Evan's help, the starting point of an equivalent for the state to say, what kinds of money could you use to pay for different things? And I'm curious about whether people want to see us build this out. So my screenshot is equally bewildering and tiny. I took the federal one, added a couple of things, I think a couple of nuancy pieces, but we'll have this available to email out to folks. And as we finish it, if you find this useful, please let us know. So we've got links to our programs for active transportation, public transportation, the local programs division that does the HSIP funding administration, TIB. We'll be adding Traffic Safety Commission. They have a few like school zone grants, that kind of thing, and RCO. And Commerce actually can fund sidewalks out of community development block grants. So those hidden pots of money. So in the chat, if you've got thoughts about this as an approach to organizing the information, please let us know. The other thing is we'll have a timeline that just shows what are the cycles for applying. And with that, I'm going to ask, all right, I'm seeing yes, please on the state matrix. We'll continue to make it. Yes, the eye chart. Definitely. And with that, I'm going to ask the folks who are helping us troubleshoot the Q&A section to come online too and tell us what you want to build. And we'll think about how you might go looking for money to do that. I don't know if it's Vicki or Tamar who's helping us with the Q&A.
Here I am. Everyone's being so shy on this Monday morning. And so I'm going to take a second to encourage everybody on the other side of my screen. Please post your questions in the chat. I know that probably all drinking through a fire hose with this information. It was a lot, right? And it's so cool that this session is recorded, so you can go back and listen to it, watch it with your co-workers and kind of or fellow conspirators, advocates, and really digest it. So I think one immediate question, did the federal matrix link get posted in the chat yet? That's a logistical question. I love these matrices. And so I feel like you're getting a lot of nods, virtual nods around that. There was one question in the chat that is pretty specific. Where would programs that reach across the Columbia River fall? For example, regional monies for adjacent states. I think this question was answered in the chat, but I think it's always good to restate. So who wants to take this one? Is this a Barb question?
Well, I think Darren had some response about looking to TA. There are also some bi-state metropolitan planning organizations. I don't know if everybody knows that, but the Walla Walla Valley is actually Washington and Oregon. Lewis and Clark Valley is actually Washington and Idaho. So I always want to remind folks looking at the local level of agency to look to your regional planning organization. And if you're anywhere close to a border, see if they're doing bi-state planning. I don't think there is one for Vancouver, Portland. I think regional, and RTC is the one on the Vancouver side of the river. Yeah. So as far as money to plan regionally, I think that feels like that FHWA level, each level of jurisdiction rising up, as it were.
I can't jump in actually with some public transportation funds on that one. We have, through our Consolidated program, funded a mobility management project. It's called MCED. And it's 5 counties, 3 in Washington, 2 in Oregon. It's around the Hood River area. So I apologize for not knowing the counties in Oregon. I think it's Wasco and something else, but then Klickitat and Skamania counties on the Washington side. So mobility management does a lot of planning activities, and it's not just focused on public transportation, but transportation as a whole. What are the solutions people need to get across the river there? Another option could possibly be applying to the Consolidated Grant Program for planning funds. So if people need maybe active transportation planning as a project, keep in mind that it would have to have a special needs element to that project request to be eligible to apply for those funds. So that's probably the one thing I can say from the public transportation side of things.
Evan, would you mind running as a quick pop quiz, running through the list when you say special needs, whose transportation needs are included in that?
Yeah, so again, that is the special needs by the state definition that we use is anyone who, because of age, disability, or income, does not have access to transportation or cannot purchase transportation for themselves. So people with disabilities, people of low income status, people over the age of 65 or under the age of 18, and also people in rural areas.
So that's a big chunk of people.
It is.
So much of the state is rural, for one thing.
That's right. We do have a lot of rural funding through that program. We have some state funding for that, and we also have some pass-through Federal Transit Administration dollars, known as 5311, that we pass through as well. So if I remember right, we fund around $45 million every biennium through that program alone.
I'm going to keep us moving because we have some grade A students in the chat who have posted some questions. I'm just going to go in the order that they've been posted because they're all kind of rapid fire. But again, if you want a grade A, post your question in the chat. Okay, any funding for local governments to hire for active transportation positions?
Not from us, not from WashDOT. I think there is a small amount of money available from the Traffic Safety Commission for school zone crossing guards, which is very specific, but that is not funding that. Sorry.
On the federal side, real quick.
The federal side, under transportation alternatives, we can fund state positions. So we fund, you can fund a ped bike coordinator at the state level, and I believe a safe routes coordinator now as well. And I believe, similar to what Barb says, I believe crossing guards as part of a safe routes program may be an eligible expenditure. But in terms of sort of, say like a local program manager or something like that, I do not know of an eligibility, but I would, that would be a good discussion item for your state contacts.
Okay, I'm hearing fund internally and then go for grants for other things. Okay, next question. How to fund sidewalk gaps along an arterial? The former state highway connecting a highly vulnerable community, adjacent wetlands mean development won't pay for these improvements. This is a great case study. Often too small to warrant federal funding. The issues of federalizing a project, as we all know, but can we string a bunch together with other ped and safety improvements? Ooh,
Wow.
Who wants to tackle this?
I'll say this feels like you might turn up on a Connecting Communities pilot program GIS analysis coming soon to allow me, depending on the demographics of that location, since you said former state route. I will tell you this first cut at doing that program analysis, what you find out is what data you don't have. That's what I already found out in doing the active transportation plan, and what state routes were turned over to locals is one of those interesting things. Like they went bye-bye. So we may not get everything in the first pass, but we will continue to work on it. Now I'm wishing I'd gotten Environmental Services Office to join us to talk wetlands and stormwater management because don't want to hurt any fish. I will tell you one thing too, and if Ashley's still in the chat, he can back me up on this because he's the one who told me this. Cities can actually build continuous sidewalks against undeveloped property and then just bill the developer when they come along. And what cities usually do is wait for the developer. So they'll build a sidewalk here and then there's dirt and then there's a sidewalk. It doesn't have to be that way if your city chooses to use its powers for good. So something to explore and to find out, is your city doing that? And I don't think that's all the wetlands issue, but just the patchwork issue, it might help.
Issues. I want any other folks with this complex?
I just want to chime in on the speaker's sort of proposal to package a gap together with other projects. While there's certainly nothing, there's nothing preventing that in many of the current federal programs, but I think the sort of the novel nature of that active transportation infrastructure investment program and the neighborhood access and equity programs is that they are explicitly asking for grant applications that take sort of that network scale approach to where, say, you're in a town and you are identifying your highest priority sidewalk gaps, plural, and applying to sort of hit things at a network scale. So it's certainly, it's a good, I think it's a very good strategy to be thinking about in the long term for addressing a lot of gaps where you're quite right, addressing one sidewalk gap may not be the most appropriate way to, might not be the most appropriate project to try and federalize.
Kind of leads into the next question, which I think is probably, so it's from Tacoma, but I think many of us around the state could relate. We have a 1.3 billion with a B funding gap for sidewalks and curb ramps in our community. Most funding opportunities we've seen are pretty corridor focused. Are there any good funding opportunities that would help us tackle a package of our highest priority sidewalk and curb ramps based on safety, equity, and connectivity prioritization, I would assume? So, Darren, I think this speaks to what you were just talking to, so I'll start with you.
It does. So it's those two hopefully future programs I mentioned. They are, especially the active transportation infrastructure investment program, it's directly on target. I will caution you, it is not a huge program. So I expect that, like many discretionary grant programs, it will be heavily subscribed. The amounts that are being tossed around for the first round of funding, I believe the House has proposed 100 million and the Senate has proposed 25 million. And so distribute that for an entire year's grant funding for everybody across the country who wants to apply. It's going to be a hard program to count upon. But again, it's hopefully a harbinger of the way things may get funded in the future, whether through neighborhood access and equity, that's
right.
about all I can say.
No, that's great. Okay, on the WashDOT side, stateside thoughts, and I know that Bob, you've been on the Transportation Improvement Board for a number of years, so I'm hoping you can be wearing that hat as you think about this too. Is that a source for this kind of thing?
And since Ashley's in the Q&A, although he had a tech issue, so he's on his phone, so I don't know how much he wants to type into his phone, but none of us have enough money for the need. That's the really sad truth, that what is needed in Tacoma is the entirety of all of the active transportation funding under Move Ahead Washington. That's for one city. And so it's going to have to be a partnership. I think the package approach, though, that larger scale thinking to say, here's the network and here's all the gaps in the network, that is what's going to, I think, be more appealing at the federal level. I'm just guessing here, but also, when we look at the applications we got this time, jurisdictions thought bigger about doing a larger scale ask instead of the spot. So that will help. I'm seeing the question about, do you have a transportation benefit district? Is everybody being asked to come to the table with something? I wish we had answers. Am I still screen sharing? So you are seeing my...
Yes.
Okay. Well, then you're going to see all my calendar reminders come in. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, we didn't see that. Okay. We just saw the encouragement to vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the uneducated moderator is going to pop in for a second. I feel like what I've seen with communities around the state is enacting transportation benefit districts as a way to say, okay, this is a pot of money it is not project specific, it's project type specific. And so I'm curious if Tacoma has a transportation benefit district. Obviously not the most progressive revenue source, but got to do what we can. So
and that got expanded a bit in the last session. I think the ability of the city council to do things directly rather than taking it to a vote, also their capacity to do things increased a bit, which is a decision they got elected to make. I will also say, beyond transportation funding, thinking about things like, I know Tacoma has a Metropolitan Parks District. That's a separate taxing district. So it could build things that are within its purview, its mission as a parks district, which might be some pieces of it. That's not sidewalk gaps. That's not probably not curb ramps and some of those things you're describing that are missing. But looking across beyond transportation to who else is investing in some element of your connectivity. So you don't ask for money for that from this pot if you could get it from this one.
Right, and I feel like this is obviously a presentation about external funding, but maybe a future conversation is like, what are those internal agency levers that you can pull to advance which types of projects? Okay, jumping back to the chat. 2 common barriers when applying for federal grants for active transportation. One, federalizing a project. We already talked about that, like the cost and burdensome reporting, right? And then the cost/difficulty of preparing cost-benefit analyses. Do you have advice for agencies who are kind of weighing these literally cost-benefit of federalizing a project? And I guess I'm going to shoot this to Darren or Bob if you want to weigh in. Yeah.
Darren has a new resource out, I think, on cost-benefit analysis.
Hi. I'm sorry, I was typing something different in the chat about another potential funding source. Yes, so there is a new resource out about cost-benefit analysis regarding active transportation, and I'm going to have to find a link to that. It was not put out by my office. I don't have any great advice on overcoming some of the burden that comes inherent with a federal project. The Federal Aid Highway Program is very much set up around stewardship and around sort of preventing waste, fraud, and abuse on, say, a huge mega project, and on complying with such things as the National Environmental Policy Act, Environmental Protection Act, et cetera. So it is sort of a difficult road to hoe for especially something like some of the previous questioners talking about trying to fix a discrete sidewalk gap. We are sort of working on doing what we can internally, and one of the main roadmaps and accountability tools that we put out for doing that was under the bipartisan infrastructure law. We were tasked to put together a report to Congress that identified some of the biggest barriers to complete streets implementation within the Federal Aid Highway Program. I will track down a link to that. It's if you'd like to sort of take a look at our current thinking on what some of the biggest barriers are and what we've put ourselves on record to Congress to do about them. It may not get into you could talk to 100 people and get about 500 different discrete issues that we could be getting into, but hopefully some of the main barriers are reflected in some of the themes and goals that are included in there, and I will try and track down a link to that.
And this also relates a bit to somebody's question when Roger was talking about how do you know you have these greater job benefits, and that's all of the jobs analysis of any transportation project. It's the actual building of the project. It's episodic. It's not the long-term benefit of providing green, clean transportation and all of that kind of thing. But there is a report, and I think because we're going to run out of time, I think I'm going to ask if we can email out lots of things afterwards, because there was a study on that. And that's an element of that cost benefit analysis, is to say it creates more jobs than other kinds of transportation investments you could be making. On the federal side of things, what our division does with the funds that we get is where we have federal money, those go to the bigger jurisdictions that are already set up to account for them. So if we're going to do a Safe Routes grant with federal dollars, it's likely to go to a bigger jurisdiction, and we use the state dollars for the smaller jurisdiction. So we're trying to manage that to help.
Great conversation in the chat about Tacoma. See, you get other people helping you if you post your question in the chat. They do have a TBD. Okay, I think we've sort of covered this, but I comment around smaller jurisdictions inherently have smaller staff pools, staff transitions really sets things back, and also just less capacity within the agency, right, to apply to grant programs, to have the shiny grant proposals that our biggest cities just do and know how to do. And so any thoughts on addressing the local burden to accessing those funds? I know that I'm going to put Bob, not put you on the spot because you're on a panel. This is what you're doing. To ask you to talk about, I know that in the Safe Routes to School, Ped Bike, and other programs, you're kind of grappling with this. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I love hearing people ask for things they need, because one of the possible opportunities, and we'll see how the legislature responds to this idea, but it came up in a conversation with the legislator about the lack of capacity to do these kinds of things, like develop your plan. And they're not going to say, yes, sure, go ahead and fund 50 FTE across the state. But if we propose a line that says this is to support and enhance capacity of local jurisdictions to plan, to go after federal dollars, that kind of thing, that we build in this sort of responsiveness line. And that's not what they're used to seeing, honestly, in the Safe Routes or Ped Bike. They're used to seeing this at the corner of 134th and 28th. They're very specific spots. This would be a different approach, but it would say we will prioritize those places that haven't been able to do this themselves because they don't have the capacity. And can we, in some way, shape, or form, fund the development of the plan, support collaborative grant writing approaches? Maybe it's jurisdictions along a corridor that can't independently stand it up, but they could work together. And the MPOs and RTPOs have a role to play here too. They are also under-resourced. So what I hope to shape is something that is a collaborative partnership approach, everybody doing what they want to do, that we help fill in the holes. And I see Ashley pointing out that if you can get your city to adopt a complete streets ordinance, so they're eligible for the TIB Complete Streets program, that has also funded development of bicycle pedestrian plans. And that money is, you get the grant and you spend it. It's flexible. So it's a great thing to consider going for. Looking back,
I think we may have exhausted the question. No one has any more questions about any of this stuff. It's all super clear from what you said. I'm just kidding. This is complicated, right? I don't see any more questions in the chat. And as we wrap up, we have 1 more minute of this the presentation. I want to invite our awesome speakers to post your contact information in the chat so that as people have follow-up questions, which are inevitable, that they can contact you. I want to thank you all for spending your morning with us, both the panelists and the people on the other side of the screen. Our next and penultimate session of the summit is at noon today. Where do we go from here? Centering Community in East Central Spokane. I think this is going to be a really great discussion. I hope that you can all join us for it. And I do want to encourage you all to add your feedback about this session and the rest of the sessions of the summit. But I'm going to take a second, because this is the last session I'm going to moderate of the sessions of the summit, to say your feedback is really important. We think that these conversations are essential to local jurisdictions, state planners, and advocates to be better prepared to be doing the work ahead and achieving our shared vision of safer communities across the state. As we think about what the summit is going to look like in future, I'll be candid, we're not going to do a summit in 2023. We want to get back on the spring schedule, just to get into the weeds a little bit. So there's not going to be a summit in 2023, but we do want to know how we can support you all in this work and bring folks together for panel conversations like this. And so your feedback is absolutely important. And I encourage you to all take a couple of minutes this morning just to share your feedback so that we can know what the people on the other side of the screen really think. And with that, again, thank you for attending. Thank you all to our awesome speakers, Evan, Joel, Barb. I think we lost a speaker already, or I just lost one from my screen. Thank you, and have a good rest of your morning.
Thank you for allowing FHWA to come talk to you all.
Anytime.
Thanks for having me, everyone.